Hello, welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse, and before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course, my underwater train finders, Thomas Ward, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, and some dude 267. You are the reason why this content remains impervious to something I don't know, not really, but we're going to go with it. Anyway, today we're going to discuss something that we've actually discussed before, at least in concept, and I really thought that this would not actually happen again, but I just need to stop talking, is what it is. Because every time I say, I hope this is the only time this has ever happened, or I hope that never happens, it turns out, no, that's a thing that happened. Remember how we discussed the time a train slammed into a tank? That's happened more than once. I learned this. And now, we're going to talk about another time it happened. This is the story of the Barberton train versus tank collision. This story stands as a testament to how, in the West, we tend to misplace or misuse or screw up or whatever our military infrastructure too. And I make the following statements as an American. You'd think with how much we spend on the stuff, and I assure you, we spend just so much money on so much, just the F-35, trillions of dollars. Oh my goodness. You'd think we'd take better care of it. And for the most part, to be fair, we're usually pretty good about, taking care of our military infrastructure. I mean, there are accidents, there are things that occur, but you'd think we wouldn't be in a position where we would, say, get one run into by one of our own trains. And yet, on April 29th, 1951, that is exactly what occurred. The tank in question today was the M4 Sherman, a medium tank that was in service between 1942 and 1957. Now, the Shermans are legendary here in America, and with good reason. They were instrumental in their role in the Allied forces during World War II. American-made, American-built, they were technically advanced for the time. They were capable of going toe-to-toe with the German Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs, and only wound up struggling a little bit against Tiger Is and Panthers. But Germany was never able to produce enough of those to really matter. And I could easily make an entire video series about the history surrounding this particular model of tank, but long story short, they are an iconic part of American military history, and were extremely good tanks. The locomotive today was Erie Railroad's 824, an EMD E8 diesel-electric locomotive. The E units as a whole were instrumental in America for ushering in the diesel age, but they often find themselves a little overshadowed by their cousins, the F units, and side by side each series looks remarkably similar. Now the E8 specifically were 2,250 horsepower and were meant for passenger service. Streamlined with the distinctive bulldog nose design as people are familiar with from that era, they were good, efficient diesels. An 824 was one of several under operation under the Erie Railroad. But how did these two vehicles wind up colliding? Well, the Sherman tank was a part of B Company in the 137th Tank Battalion of the Ohio National Guard, and the convoy was in the middle of crossing a stretch of line in Barberton, Ohio. The crossing was on Fairview, and they had to stop as warning lights started flashing. Additionally, this line was particularly complicated as there were actually 4 different sets of tracks, in order from the direction the convoy was coming from. The first 2 actually belonged to the Pennsylvania Railroad, while the second 2 were shared by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad and the Erie Railroad. The setup was also bizarre, as the second set of tracks was 2 feet uphill from the first, but they were all part of the same crossing. The convoy was halted for approximately 10 minutes while a freight train passed by. Once that happened, a police cruiser crossed the tracks without incident. Then, a National Guard lieutenant stepped out of a jeep and walked over the tracks to look in both directions and double-check the warning lights, as was procedure whenever a difficult crossing like this was being undertaken. He saw that everything was clear, and he motioned for the convoy to move across. First, a half-ton truck drove over the grade at 20 miles per hour. It was followed by one of the Sherman tanks, which was in low gear and moving only 5 miles per hour. This wasn't unusual. Shermans aren't incredibly fast, topping out at maybe 30 miles per hour, but whenever they had to go over residential streets, or in this case a railroad crossing, they had to travel at low gear so the treads didn't damage anything. But moving so slowly, and already crossing a particularly difficult spot, the tank commander, Sergeant Don W. Jameson, reacted in terror as a 6-car train, the Erie Lake Cities, also called train number 6, rounded a bend down the line, that was approximately 3,291 feet away. The train was moving at 60 miles per hour on its way from Chicago to New York. The situation was alarming. Because of how slow the tank was moving, they were never going to get across in time, so Sergeant Jameson quickly ordered the driver to stop before they got stuck on the line that the train was about to go down. Unfortunately, the tank lurched up the 2-foot slope and then halted on the rails. Jameson then immediately ordered his 5-man crew to bail out of the tank. He and Private First Class Carl Nichols leapt out of the turret, barely escaping in time. Their 3 other comrades were not able to escape. At 5:45 p.m., the 100-passenger train slammed into the M4 Sherman. The tank's turret was thrown off of it, landing 260 feet down the line. 824 derailed as it pushed the tank 130 feet, tearing up the rails and eventually coming to a rest about 900 feet from the crossing, and stayed upright but on a 45-degree slant on the hill. The crew and passengers on board the train were actually remarkably lucky. Despite the derailment and what was an incredibly solid impact, 824 held up quite well, suffering damage to her front, but otherwise fairly intact. 7 people on board the train were wounded, but no one was killed. However, the tank was not so lucky. The Sherman had been crushed like an aluminum can by the impact. The 3 men that couldn't get out in time had been killed instantly. Allegedly, the Sherman's engine actually stayed on during this, and it idled for about 15 minutes before it finally quit. The investigation after the impact was a bizarre one, as generally when these kind of crashes happen, it is always implied that the train was not at fault. After all, it couldn't stop. There was nothing it could do. The engineer had blown his horn and slammed on the emergency brake. That's about all you could ask for. However, the issue of the crossing itself was called into question. Because of the elevated nature of it, it meant that it was difficult to see all the way down the line, and the sensors that activated the lights on the crossing were not beyond the bend where the train could first be sighted. As a result, the argument was made that the crossing itself was at least partially to blame for the accident, since the military personnel did actually follow proper procedure all the way around. It was just really bad timing. In the end, it was ruled that neither party was going to be held responsible for the accident, but the railroad still decided to complete an upgrade project to the crossing itself to level the tracks out and make it much easier to see whether trains are coming down the line or not. As for the Sherman that was destroyed, well, it was likely scrapped. I couldn't find any records to confirm that, but given how damaged it was, I can't imagine they'd bother repairing it, and this was fairly close to the time Shermans were considered obsolete anyway. 824, on the other hand, like I said, made out pretty well in the exchange, all things considered. She would be repaired and continue service both with Erie, as well as being sold off to a couple other companies. Depressingly though, she couldn't escape the same fate that many of her sister locomotives also suffered. She was retired in January of 1978, and scrapped in 1979. And as much as I would love to end this video by saying that, don't worry, a train can't possibly manage to run into a tank more than twice, I already know that's not true. It's happened at least 4 times to my knowledge, including the 2 we already talked about. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.